Al-Maqrizi is someone that is really not known at all outside of specialist circles.
Why do you make the case that this guy is the greatest historian in Egypt?
The guy was basically your typical scholar, but he was very critical of authority. This is a guy who actually poured his emotions into his writing, as opposed to the more stale writing of most of his competitors who would tell you today the Sultan executed 10 rebels. He has a huge project on the life of the Prophet. The guy was very, very devout. He was motivated by his fear of the destruction of the city, and he wanted to preserve the memory of Egypt. But the book is really 3 parts: Life of Al-Maqrizi, Work of Al-Maqrizi, Afterlife of Al-Maqrizi. Ibn Khaldun was a peacock, was someone who thought so highly of himself that in most of his writing, he put down everyone else. And he is very keen on showing up and telling you how intelligent he is and how well-read he is. He also is an amazingly eloquent writer. Afikra is one of the most innovative projects to communicate across the Arab world that I have encountered.
Hey, welcome to the Afikra podcast. My name is Mikey Mhenna. Today we have a special episode because we have a repeat guest. This is really special for me, and you'll understand why in a second. But Professor Nasser Rabbat is the Aga Khan Professor and Director of the Aga Khan Program for Islamic Architecture at MIT since 1999, and has been a big supporter of Afikra for many years. And it's a privilege and a pleasure to welcome him back. Nasser, welcome to the series.
Thank you, Monkey. This is a privilege also to me, and Afikra is one of the most innovative projects to communicate across the Arab world that I have encountered. So I am still a supporter of Afikra and a fan.
Yeah, you know, the reason why this is special for me is because you were one of those first episodes, many years ago, that the buy-in really meant a lot to me. The fact that you said, "Yalla, let's do it." And so I really appreciate it. But today we're talking about a relatively new book of yours named Writing Egypt that looks at Al-Maqrizi. And so I want to talk about this character and ask you, why did it take you so long to write this book?
Yeah, I have no excuse. I think actually procrastination is most probably the main reason, but there are also other reasons. I can share them with you.
Yeah.
At MIT, not at MIT, in American universities in general, we have the tenure system, and you are in the first 7 years of your career, you're really racing against time to publish so that you will be looked at favorably for the tenure. So I had the first book, which was my dissertation, and I knew that that was going to be out. And I got myself a grant to go and write another book. And I was in the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, where I was supposedly writing that other book on Islamic sources on art and architecture. And there was a section on Maqrizi. We are now in 1998. And I sent the manuscript to 2 of my senior colleagues to read it. And one of them, Renata Holod, who just retired from Penn now, and she's in her 80s now, sent back saying, the best section of the document that you shared with me is the one on Maqrizi. Why don't you write a book on the guy? So in 1998, I thought, I'm going to write this book on the guy. And I started. I got a contract with a series that was being produced by another member of the Institute for Advanced Study, Patricia Krone, the famous historian who attacked early Islamic history and who was a fabulous historian of the Abbasid period, even though she was biased to the core against Islam, Muslims, and contemporary Muslims. So she contracted me to write a book of 30,000 words on Maqrizi. And I did that, and she didn't like it because it was too scholarly. She wanted something that was addressed to the general population. At that time, we are in like 2005, 2006, and I got busy in other books. And then in 2011, the revolutions in the Arab world happened, the Arab Spring happened. And I rediscovered Al-Maqrizi because what I had discovered while researching him 10 years before is that the guy was basically your typical scholar, very weak and very meek and somehow beholden to authority, but he was very critical of authority. And he wrote about that, which is exactly what scholars do, or which is exactly what I was doing myself in 2011. So this is a self-identification with a historian who is critical of the authorities of his time. And that brought me back to him. Al-Maqrizi is someone that is really not known at all outside of the specialist circles, especially people who work on pre-modern Egypt, because he is a historian of Egypt. So this is a plus and a minus. He's a historian of Egypt, which means if you're interested in other places, you might not encounter him. But he is a very meticulous and very detailed historian of Egypt, so no scholar that works on Egypt can escape Al-Maqrizi or say that I don't know who Al-Maqrizi is or was. But he was born in 1366, so in the second half of the 14th century, into a family of, on one side, scholarly, on the other side, less so, but still a family of scribes, of bureaucrats. His father was a lower bureaucrat in the Mamluk administration. His maternal grandfather is the most famous member of his family. He was the judge of the Mamluk army, the chief judge of the Mamluk army, which is a relatively high position for religious individuals, not for military or for scribal individuals. And he was raised in the house of his maternal grandfather. Both his father and his maternal grandfather. His father came from Damascus, and his grandfather, on his father's side, was a famous scholar of sorts who was born in Baalbek in Lebanon today. So the grandfather came from Baalbek to Damascus. The father came from Damascus to Cairo, married the daughter of this chief judge of the army, and worked in the administration. And Makrizi was born in that environment. So he was born in a scholarly environment, especially that the house of his grandfather was a place where scholars met and debated and so on. I mean, there was a salon of sorts in the house of his maternal his maternal grandfather. So Makrizi had that privileged upbringing in a way, but clearly he was, I should say, sort of like a rebellious kid, but not to the point where he would act upon his rebelliousness. He acted upon it when his father and grandfather died one after the other. The first one, when Makrizi was less than 10, he lost his father, and he was less than 15 when he lost his maternal grandfather, who was introducing him to the world of the Mamluk administration. Immediately after these two died, one of them, his father, was of the Hanbali madhab, and his maternal grandfather was of the Hanafi madhab. Maqrizi, when he turned 18, switched to the Shafi'i madhab, and I interpret it as an act of rebellion, because he could have remained a Hanbali scholar or a Shafi'i scholar, but he chose to, or a Hanafi scholar, but he chose to move to the Shafi'i, and he became a lifelong enemy of the Hanafi. He was always putting them down. So in today's world, of course, we usually look for some sort of a psychological trauma. Is he reacting to his grandfather? His grandfather was perhaps too strict of a teacher. Because the grandfather dies, he switches from Hanafi to Shafi'i. The other possibility, which is what many scholars have favored, is that most of the scholars of Egypt in the 14th century were Shafi'i. So he basically joined the larger school of jurisprudence. But he also joined a mazhab that was on the wane at the time and still is on the wane. Today, you find followers of that mazhab only in few cities around the Islamic world, mostly in Saudi Arabia, and this is the Zahiri mazhab, a rather strict mazhab that subscribes to the idea of interpreting the religious text, the Quran, that is on its face, on its surface, that is not to allow any interpretation, to basically explain rather than to interpret and look for causality behind the verses or try to somehow understand the meaning of the verse beyond what the surface meaning is. And I tried to make the claim in my book that throughout his life he was a committed Zahiri, even though he never said it openly. And when his colleague, peer, maybe actually a little bit superior, was asked about him being a Zahiri, he poo-pooed him a little bit during their lifetimes and said he doesn't know anything about the Zahiri mazhab. I suspect that this is just professional rivalry. I think that Maqrizi understood the Zahiri mazhab quite well. He was an admirer of the scholar Ibn Hazm al-Andalusi of the 12th century, who is famous for us today because he wrote a book about love. I don't know if you've ever encountered that book. It's called Tawq al-Hamama, the bracelet of the dove. And that book had made him famous. He was a philosopher and a scholar. He revised the principles of the Zahiri mazhab and made it available to a larger number. And in 11th century, the Zahiri mazhab was actually a sizable mazhab in the Islamic world. As I said earlier, today, there are maybe a couple of hundreds of people who subscribe to the Zahiri interpretation
Can I
or
just
jurisprudence.
ask you a basic question?
Yeah.
First of all, can you define mazhab?
Mazhab is a school of jurisprudence, which basically is a school of interpreting laws based on the Quran and the Hadith. And there are variations in how you approach interpretation. And because a mazhab is a school of thought, so what you usually have is a founder of the mazhab. So Shafi'i, Hanafi, they're all named after their founders, and then their students and the students of their students and the students of the students of their students, they all write commentaries on the opinions of the masters, and the whole corpus become the body of information or of knowledge for adherent to the mazhab. Ultimately, they have little differences in terms of saying the rule for such and such infraction, let's say, for example, is 10 days in prison. The other mazhab will come and say, no, this is an infraction that is of a much more broader importance, and the rule is a year in prison. So what has happened over history, especially from the 13th, 14th century on, is that the political authorities took advantage of those discrepancies between the mazhab, and they would have to use one of the mazhab, for example, to make assessment of a situation, and they will use, of course, the mazhab that is more lenient or that will go their way. And therefore, in the Islamic world, in most countries of the Islamic world, not all of them, you started having four chief judges of the four dominant mazhab: Shafi'i, Hanafi, Maliki, which is dominant in North Africa, and Hanbali, which is the smallest among them. Now, there had been dozens of madhahib, not just four only, but these are the four that survived, and Al-Zahiri, the one that I'm talking about, which Maqrizi apparently adhered to. So Maqrizi was a Shafi'i Zahiri or a Zahiri Shafi'i.
Okay. All right. I want to just get a general sense of the Egypt that this guy was born into. It's interesting because, like, when you talk about like the greatest historian, historians largely tell, they tell the story, they create a narrative, they try to look backwards and make sense of history and how we got here and where we might be going. So let me just ask you a really basic question. What did people think the history of Egypt was before this guy came around?
Well, I mean, this guy came not into a void, I have to say. History writing is something that was started initially to write the history of the Prophet in Islamic tradition. And we have very little history writing from the early Islamic period. And if you go to, I mean, we start having more and more historians by the 8th century. And the Muslims have learned history writing from the Greeks and the Persians. So they adopted some from here, some from there, to the point where it could be that the term tarikh is derived initially from some sort of a Persian term. So the whole enterprise of writing history is imported and then Islamized. But for reasons that are still not very clear, the late 14th, early 15th century was the golden age of Arabic history writing. And the center of that golden age was Cairo. Maqrizi was one of about 200 historians working in Cairo at the end of the 14th century, beginning of the 15th century, who were chronicling the events of Egypt and Syria, of the Mamluk Empire during that time. So he had a huge competition. And the fact that he had become one of the most famous, if not the most famous, is a reflection, in my opinion, actually, of his breadth of knowledge, but also of his subjectivity, because this is a guy who actually poured his emotions into his writing, as opposed to the more stale writing of most of his competitors who would tell you today the Sultan executed 10 rebels, and then the Emir so and so married his daughter to the Emir so and so. But it seems to me that the next question that will come to you is why that period? What was going on at that time?
Exactly.
And the answer is Cairo was the capital of the Islamic world in the late 14th century. And this is a result of the amount of money, speaking of money, that was poured by the authorities into scholarship. Exactly what the Trump administration is trying to stop now, and somehow to dry the great scholarship that is produced in America. In the late 14th, early 15th century, the Mamluk rulers of Egypt were pouring an exaggerated amount of money into the support of madrasas and khankas and scholars and so on.
Can I ask a
Now,
side question before we keep on going?
mhm,
Where was this money coming from?
taxation. So, I mean, this is a very valid question, because why are they putting this money in? And that takes us to saying, who were the Mamluks? The Mamluks were basically imported boys that were enslaved and brought to be put to strenuous training for 10 years while they are slaves of some emir, and then they will be manumitted and they will join the army, they will get a salary, ultimately they will get an iqta from the state. An iqta is a piece of land whose income is given to you. The piece of land is not yours, you just get the income from it. This is the difference between the feudal system in Europe, where the land becomes yours, and the iqta in the Islamic world, especially in Egypt and Syria, because they are exception, where the piece of land is still owned by the state, and you only get the return from that piece of land, the agricultural income. And the Mamluks basically confiscated all land in Egypt and made it owned by the state, basically by themselves. But the iqta is yours only while you are in service. So if you are an emir in the Mamluk army and you have an iqta in the form of 3 villages, all the income from these 3 villages comes to you. But if you are killed or dismissed or executed for any number of reasons, your family does not inherit anything. So, and this is why they were pouring money into scholarship, establishing charitable foundations allowed them to divert some of that money to themselves. And this is why Cairo became the learning capital of the Islamic world. Cairo, during the Mamluk period, had 900 institutions. This is unusual, unbelievable. every Amir was establishing either a mosque or a madrasa or a khanqa. And every Amir in the waqf, which is the perpetual endowment deed, basically the state cannot interfere in that. And what they usually do is they put one or two of the villages that they have as iqta as waqf.
Yeah, it's like a tax loophole.
Yeah, exactly. And then they appoint themselves the supervisors of the waqf, and they give themselves a huge salary. And then in the text of the waqf they say, and after we die, it's the oldest of our sons, and when he dies, the second one, and on, to the point where they have a whole chain of heirs, including their own slaves. The last would be the slave, and then at the end they say, and if we are extinct as a family, then the waqf goes back to the sultan.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit of the structure of the book and sort of the why you structured it this way. Maybe we'll actually, before we get to the structure, let's just answer the basic question. Why do you make the case that this guy is the greatest historian in Egypt?
Multiple reasons. I'll list few of them. The most important reason is that this guy, after trying for about 25 years of his life to find himself a good position in administration, was disgusted by the manipulation and decided to withdraw to his family home, basically the house of his grandfather. He himself was very poor, and to devote the rest of his life to writing history. And he decided to write the history of Egypt, even though he doesn't say it. But when you analyze his work, his known works are about 37 titles, of which about 14 are huge compendia, and about 20 are shorter titles that are like almost like a treatise on something. But there are about 14 really large books. Some of them are the most famous in their fields. And of these 14, 7 are on the history of Egypt, of Islamic Egypt. This is our main source on the history of Islamic Egypt. And then he has 2 dictionary, biographical dictionaries, one about the famous people that came to Cairo or studied in Cairo or lived in Cairo and in Egypt, I'm sorry, not just in Cairo. And the other about the people that he encountered in his own life. And that gave me an entry to his persona. This is how I got to know him, because he wrote about people that he knew, and he wrote about his interaction with these people. So he did not write us an autobiography, but he wrote the biography of others that he interacted with, which actually ended up being much richer
It
autobiography.
reveals a lot about the person.
Exactly. So that the first reason is because of his integrated project of the history of Egypt. That makes him great. But the second and the more important one is that he was critical at an age in which criticism is not part of the history writing or of the chronicling or of the scholarship in general. So he was someone who did not shy away from telling you, as he's writing, that this policy is going to lead to ruination. As a matter of fact, the word ruination appears in his writing more than anything else. Kharab is, in my opinion, a term that he has theorized to the level of becoming a principle of analysis, whereby he is basically using the term kharab in order to explain to us why is the government corrupt. So he goes after the corruption of the government by telling us this corruption of the government is leading to the ruination of the country. So look at this neighborhood has lost its function.
Yeah,
This
خرب البلد.
exactly, خرب البلد. This is exactly what he's saying. So that
He
makes it.
invented this term, يعني he invented خرب البلد.
Yeah, actually, he theorized it. He did not invent it, but he gave it a real theoretical content. And the third reason is that he had some strong feelings against corruption. He did not act upon these feelings, but in his writing, he's very supportive of any rebellion against corruption. And that will immediately explain to you why I returned to him in 2011. Because I thought the Arab revolutions were this response to the corruption of the regimes in the Arab world, and that Maqrizi is just a harbinger. He did it very subjectively. This was a very subjective man. There's no objectivity in his writing. And to me, this makes him much, much, much more attractive, because objectivity is usually coldness and detachment. This guy is engaged in his writing. This guy is telling you, I don't like what the Sultan is doing. Well, the Sultan is doing it.
Yeah. It's also, I feel like it's more honest. When you see the fingerprints of the person, then it's like, obviously, when you feel the DNA of the opinion of the opiner, then I feel it's more honest.
You're putting it much better than I did, but that's precisely it. I mean, when you read Al-Maqrizi, you feel the man behind the writing.
Yeah. Okay, so I heard you say something, and you talk about this in the book. In some ways, not only is he the greatest historian, he's like almost like the quintessential Egyptian. He creates a template, like this is what it means to be Egyptian. You have to criticize the government. That's kind of this is what you're supposed to do. If you're going to be a citizen of this place, you are supposed to actually criticize and critique.
Yeah, that's a wonderful way of looking at it. And that takes me back to the question that you started with, which is the structure of the book.
Yeah.
So the book is structured in 3 parts. The first part is the life of Al-Maqrizi, simply because no one has written an elaborate biography of this guy. And I should say that the publication of that biographical dictionary that was withheld by its owner for 50 years, he published it in 2002, made the information available. Otherwise, we didn't have access to most of the material of that biographical dictionary that I said provided me with the autobiography of Maqrizi. So that allowed me to build a very robust biography. But I'm also a historian who believes that when we write ourselves. So we need to understand who the person is behind the reading that we are doing, even if the reading is about American foreign policy today, and even if it is coming at it from political science perspective and using all sorts of quantitative data and so on, there is still a person behind the writing. The second third of the book is the analysis of his historical writing on Egypt. He has a huge project, which I did not deal with in this book, on the life of the Prophet. The guy was very, very devout. So he wrote volumes upon volumes on the life of the Prophet and his descendants, and about, if you want, the mythical or the theological history of the universe from the time of creation down to the Prophet. And these books came into the reading public only in the last 20 years. They have been published very recently. And I did not deal with them in this book. So my book is really on the history of Egypt part of his oeuvre, which is more than half of his oeuvre. So that's the second part, and especially his notion of history, how he understood history, and why he wrote the book of Khitat. And that brings me back to the Kharab that we were talking about, because he was motivated by his fear of the destruction of the city, and he wanted to keep its memories. So he is actually the Egyptian Pierre Nora, the French historian who invented the notion lieu de mémoire, or a place of memory, because he wanted to preserve the memories of France. This is Pierre Nora. Maqrizi wanted to preserve the memory of Egypt, of the grand Egypt of the Fatimid, whom he admired tremendously, and he wrote this book. And the third part of the book was the afterlife of Al-Maqrizi, how Al-Maqrizi was received in our modern world. So I start from how the Ottomans translated part of Al-Maqrizi for their own taxation purposes of Egypt, to understand the division of Egypt, all the way down to his discovery in the 17th century by European Orientalists who were looking for the history of the Crusade, because he has huge sections about the history of the Crusade, all the way down to the 20th century, which brings us to your very pertinent point of Al-Maqrizi being the model citizen of Egypt. So he was rediscovered in the 20th century by the Egyptians, and that's my final chapter of the book. So he was rediscovered as a historian, and they used him as a historian, but he was also rediscovered as a citizen who defined what it means to be Egyptian, and therefore his fame moved from scholarly works to fiction. But the book is really three parts: Life of Al-Maqrizi, Work of Al-Maqrizi, Afterlife of Al-Maqrizi.
Okay, I want to talk a little bit about his relationships, and specifically Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun is this person that a lot of people know, whether they're from the Arab world or not. They think of, founder of sociology, this towering figure from the history of intellectual thought. I don't know anything about the guy. I know nothing about the guy, which maybe says a lot about me, but it's true. I know nothing about him. Was he a funny guy?
You're
Was
not,
he? Yeah.
You mean Ibn Khaldun?
I know nothing about Ibn Khaldun at all as a person. I've never even thought of him. It's hilarious. I've never even thought of him as having friends.
Yeah. So, and I think actually, if you ever thought of him as such, as you are thinking about him, then you are on the right side. Ibn Khaldun was a peacock, was someone who thought so highly of himself that in most of his writing, he put down everyone else. And he is very keen on showing up and telling you how intelligent he is and how well read he is and how above everyone else he is. He also is an amazingly eloquent writer. His Arabic style is superior to many of his colleagues. And that's what raised the irk of his peers in Egypt. Here is a Moroccan, as they call, I mean, or he is, for all intents and purposes, he's basically a North African, even though Tunisia now is claiming him, but his family came from Sevilla and before that from Hadramaut. So he's not a Tunisian. He was born in Tunisia and he served in practically all the courts in North Africa. And then he left in disgust and came to Egypt and wanted to stay in Egypt and managed to get himself a good position in Egypt. And he wrote an autobiography, by the way. So we have his
As
own
peacocks
opinion.
do.
As peacocks do. His autobiography is not personal. That is, he writes mostly to show you how great he is. And Maqrizi was his companion for ever since he arrived in Egypt. He arrived in Egypt in 1383, I think, and he died in 1406. So more than 20 years. And I think even they helped each other in pushing each other in the administration. And at one point, I suspect that Maqrizi is the one that provided Ibn Khaldun with his position of chief judge. Maqrizi mentions Ibn Khaldun in his writing as our teacher, al-Shaykh al-Jalil, Shaykhuna, the greatest master, and so on, more than 20 times. And he quotes him all the time. Ibn Khaldun never mentions Maqrizi. Maqrizi doesn't appear at all. Maqrizi is this lowly historian as opposed to this grand historian of Ibn Khaldun. Now, in all honesty, Ibn Khaldun was a grand historian. So we have to give him that. I mean, this is a guy who came up with, you called him sociologist. I still would actually prefer to call him a historical theoretician. Or if you want someone who came up with a historical theory about how states form and decline, and that history is made out of the rise and fall of states. If you remember a title that became very famous 25, 30 years ago after the fall of the Soviet Union. It was called The End of History. It was written by Francis Fukuyama, one of the main conservative historians in America who actually recently shifted and became a little bit more progressive. But The End of History is actually an echo of how Ibn Khaldun saw history. That is, history is the history of states and of the rise and decline of states. And Fukuyama said the end of history because socialism or communism was defeated. And it's the end of history because now the whole world is capitalist and we're done. That's the gist of that
There's
book.
no rising and falling. Yeah.
So Ibn Khaldun is the one that theorized the rise and fall of states. And a lot of historians after him, and I would say even Machiavelli, have been influenced by Ibn Khaldun's view of how history unfolds. The problem with Ibn Khaldun is that his sample is North Africa. He is looking at specifically a relationship between nomads and city dwellers. So he did not theorize for societies in which the relationship is between peasants and city dwellers. But that does not diminish the importance of his theory. And I claim in the book and in articles that I published that Al-Maqrizi is the first applicant of Ibn Khaldun's theory in his look at the cycles of rise and fall of the city of Cairo. Ibn Khaldun himself theorized that this is how the states happen, but never actually applied it, never looked at an actual situation and said, this is what's happening. Maqrizi did. And Maqrizi is full of praise for Ibn Khaldun. And he calls him my teacher over and over and over again. So Maqrizi recognizes Ibn Khaldun as a big influence on him, and it shows. It shows in his writing. But as I said, Ibn Khaldun was so busy rubbing shoulders with the grandees of the states, he had no time for these little lowly historians.
Yeah. You'd mentioned that he was not a rich man, but he was born into a sort of a scholarly family. I'm curious, in Mamluk Egypt, was there a correlation between wealth and scholarship, and sort of like literacy and scholarship among families?
Yes, of course. I mean, I have to take you back to the notion of the Waqf. So the Waqf paid salaries for teachers in the madrasas and in the mosques. And the way it worked for these families that have somehow cornered the market, if you want, is that you will end up being appointed as a teacher in 5 madrasas. So you get 5 salaries and you repeat the same class. You move from one madrasa to the other and you teach the same class and you get 5 salaries. So there was wealth in the scholarly community, and it was wealth that was manipulated by top families. There are few scholars that lived an extremely poor life, including people that Maqrizi was very close to. But Maqrizi, being the grandson of the Qadi al-Jaysh, of the judge of the army, the supreme judge of the army, was very well connected to members of the ruling class, of the Mamluk ruling class, or of the wealthy families of, be it administrative bureaucrats or merchants. So Maqrizi had patronage. But Maqrizi, as I said, when he turned 49, decided to withdraw from the rat race of administrative positions and did not occupy any position after that. But I am 100% sure that he was very, very, very poor. I mean, there are few hints here and there where once he was sick and he wanted to do chicken soup, so he sent his servant to buy chicken, and the servant came back and said, this is how much it will cost to buy 2 chicken, and Maqrizi gave up on it and wrote this in his chronicle. So he did not, and when he died, he was buried in a big cemetery with probably no marker for his burial. He spent the last couple of years of his life actually in a khanqa, in a Sufi hostel. So yeah, he was poor. I would actually still maintain my claim that he was a very poor person.
Okay, I have a question for you. This is going to sound strange, but I'm like really, really curious. You happen to be a really funny person. You have a good sense of humor. You're a funny guy. Egyptians are hilarious. In 2025, and
Remember, I'm not Egyptian.
I know you're not Egyptian. But Egyptians, I don't know if you would agree. I think Egyptians have a well-earned reputation for being very funny.
Yeah, they have a refined sense of humor.
So, was that true in Mamluk Egypt? When you read his writing, where you're like, he is of the same culture of Egypt today. This is the same place.
He himself is less funny than what you are ascribing to him. But we do have funny authors, and we do have people who show that sense of humor even when they are reporting the bloodiest of events. And we even have, I mean, the one example from 100 years before, Al-Maqrizi, of plays that were written for the caracos, for the marionette, for the puppets. And we do have those texts, and they are hilarious, and they are critical of the authority and so on. The author was called Ibn Daniel, and he lived in the Ayyubid period, and he was a scribe in the administration who at night was writing these plays that made fun of everything around him in Egypt. So yes, a sense of humor transpires in the historical writing of Egyptians about Egypt.
It's interesting that I guess I'm trying to get to like a deeper point of like, if this guy is the greatest Egyptian historian, right? Is it?
I claim that, at least.
You claim that, right? So if that's the case, I always wonder, like when I go back 500 years, are these places the same places? I mean, obviously nation states change and sort of like your paperwork changes. But are these histories connected, and are the cultures the exact same? Are they?
As a historian, my answer is an unequivocal no. That is, I'm someone who believes in change, and I'm someone who believes that things don't stay the same. But there are traits of people, there are qualities that, collective qualities, if you want, that somehow get reinforced or sometimes they get weakened. And the sense of humor is something that you can see in Egypt from early on. Um, there are few other traits that the Egyptians are accused of that people would say that have lasted over the centuries. I personally think more, I mean, as a more of a materialist historian or more of a Marxist historian, if you want, I think that we have to look always for socio-economic causalities and see how people react to conditions that they're living in. So Egypt, and this is what perhaps gives the permanence to what you're talking about, is a country that needs an extremely sophisticated level of organization to survive, because it depended for centuries, for millennia actually, on the flooding of the Nile. And the flooding of the Nile, if it is not harnessed, is destructive. And if it is destructive, it causes famine. And Egypt has gone through series of famine where a huge percentage of the population dies because of mismanagement, not because of anything else. So Egypt is in need of management. And when the management is not doing well, of course, the population is going to become critical. So there is such a trait, but also needing management and a robust and a strong management means that Egypt had suffered more than its fair share of autocratic regimes, because you need to organize for the well-being, the economic well-being of the country. And that is, in my opinion, something that stays in the history of Egypt and affect the character of the Egyptians.
Because it's like it's related to the topography of the place.
Precisely. And the climate, and if you want, the cycle of the Nile, the flooding of the Nile. Egypt is, I mean, Herodotus said it, and probably not so knowingly, that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And it's true, because take the Nile out, Egypt is basically a desert.
Yeah. Within the 20th century lens, how do you feel Makrizi's role is today? Like how are people writing? Maybe I'll ask it this way: how are people writing Egypt now?
Yeah. Maqrizi himself has actually fared much better as a companion or interlocutor or inspiration to fiction about Egypt than he did to history writing about Egypt. So historians have used Maqrizi for the mundane function of a source of information. Few of them have used him as a model citizen because he's full of praise and love for Egypt. He actually says it openly in the introduction to his khitat. The sentence that he uses in order to speak about how much he loves Egypt and what Egypt means for him has been used by countless people, including myself, to speak about the love of country, the love
what
of
is
the
the line?
homeland. It's I need to actually open it to tell you, to read it to you without having to change it. But Makrizi's love of country is something that has been retained, if you want, in our modern time. But there is more than that. There is Makrizi the critique, and there is Makrizi the one who preserved the memories of Egypt. And this is what I discovered in the writing of the literateurs, of the novelists and the poets. They noted that much more so. They noted that memory function of Al-Maqrizi more so than the historians did. And to me, this made the literature much better gauge of what Makrizi represents today. Now, there is a dark aspect, if you want, or there is another aspect of Makrizi, which I did not analyze in the book, but it does exist. And that is, his conservatism. For people who are, especially we are in the age of conservatism, he had become a hero to the point where a center funded by a Salafi in London was called Al-Maqrizi Center for Studies, and it was closed. And it was closed by the security services in London. And the person who founded this is actually considered to be a Salafi jihadi of the first degree. So Makrizi represents somehow one of these conservative uh, precursors to modern writing about, because this is what Makrizi believed, that the state is failing because it deviated from Islamic law. And of course, actually, this is the whole claim of the Salafis today. So there is that aspect of Maqrizi that is being revived. I didn't write about it. I actually thought about writing about that center in London. But when I did my Google search for it took me to the security page and saying this page has been closed by so and so. And I feared for myself that somebody is going to come after me and say, why are you trying to find information about this organization in particular? Um,
Wait,
but
hold on. I want to go back to the sentence. Did you find it or
yeah,
no?
no, I haven't found it yet, but I will. I will. Give me 1 second, and I will
Take your
find
time.
it.
Take your time.
All right, here it is. I'm going to read you the English translation. If you want the Arabic translation, I will need to do another search. Is it okay to read the English, or do
Yeah,
you want
sure.
the Arabic?
Yeah.
Okay. So, in the introduction to his khitat, this is what he writes. He says, Misr is the place of my birth, the playground of my mates, the nexus of my society and clan, the home to my family and public, al-amma, the bosom where I acquired my wings, and the niche I seek and yearn to. Ever since I sought knowledge and God gave me intelligence and understanding, I have wanted to know its events, أخبارها, to draw from its wells of information and to question travelers and the inhabitants of its countries. So, over many years, I recorded in my own handwriting and collected many accounts that no book usually contains or that no cover can hold because of their large number and their wonder. غرابتها. So, this very small one, where it is the place of birth, the playground of the mate, the nexus of the society and clan, the home to the family and public, the people who read him, the people who he interacts with, the bosom where he acquired his wing, and the niche he seeks and yearns to. This is really nationalism before we have nationalism. The whole
Yeah, it's like a patriotism.
Yeah, it's patriotism less so than nationalism, because nationalism is something that didn't appear until the 19th century and the rise of a nation state. But here we have someone who really identifies with Egypt in the strongest possible terms. And it's justifiable for contemporary historians and contemporary novelists of Egypt to see in him the model citizen because of a sentence such as this one.
Yeah. If he were to write a sort of top 10 list or sort of a rules for citizenship, what do you think would be his main things? Like, in order to be a great citizen of Egypt or a great citizen of any nation, one must, what would they be?
Well, I mean, love of country, care for the country, worry about what's going on for the country and try to sort of like counter it if it is negative. All of this is expressed by him, by the way. And he defends of the country reputation. He has a section in which he brings people who came to Egypt and critiqued it and said it's a dirty country or it's this or that. And he goes after them and says, very logically, by the way, he doesn't get angry. He says they are wrong because look at what this other person had said. So defending the country, defending the reputation of the country.
It's interesting. I like this idea of love of country. I want to talk about this for a second because in today's day, when people think of love of country, they think of the flag, they think of your passport, they think of the nation state.
Nationalism. I mean, these are all, if you want, the paraphernalia of nationalism.
Exactly.
Flag didn't mean anything to him. Of course, there was no national anthem to say that this is our national anthem. And the idea of a country, I mean, this is the other thing that you can see in here, is that what he, in his description of his relationship to the country, he's describing the people. He's not describing the land. The idea of identifying with a geographic piece of land that has borders is very modern idea. People identified perhaps with their cities or their villages or their neighborhood or their sect or their peers. Like you would say, Ana Haddad, and I'm part of the guild of Haddadin, or Ana Beiruti, and I'm from Beirut. Oh, you never would say Ana Lebanese in the 14th century. This did not exist. It wasn't something that you could imagine. There was no border. And you say that if you cross from here to there, you are in Syria rather than in Lebanon. That did not exist in the imagination. So nationalism redefined for us what it means to be of a certain country.
What's interesting is that he didn't say, I'm from this neighborhood. He said, Misr.
In this sentence, but
in this sentence, so when he's talking about his country, he's talking about what we think of as country.
Yeah, but he's also very proud of being of Harit Bourgeois, and he speaks about it as something that distinguishes him and other people that came from that Hara. No, I mean, it's very clear that Al-Maqrizi identified with Egypt, but the Egypt that he identifies with is the place of his birth, but it's the playground of his mates, the nexus of his society and clan, and the home to his family and public. It's the people. Maqrizi cannot tell you that Egypt ends here and Libya starts or Palestine starts, because that's not something that he would imagine. Egypt is where people who identify with Egypt live, and he identifies with them, and they are his people. Of course, actually, the word Misr is important to remember in here. It has a double use in the Egyptian vocabulary or lingo. Misr is not Egypt. Misr is also Cairo. So it is possible that what he's saying in here is Cairo is the playground of his mates and the place of his birth.
It would be the equivalent of somebody saying, like, I love New York. They're not talking about New York State. They're talking about New York City.
Precisely. And as a matter of fact, actually, we know for a fact that people identified with their cities in the pre-modern period.
Yeah. It's interesting because, you know, Anna, I always describe myself as from Beirut. If I ever say that I'm Lebanese, I always try to catch myself and I say, no, I think I'm more Beiruti than I am Lebanese, right? But it's interesting. It's what's interesting about this, because Inta, in your book, you didn't say the greatest historian of Cairo.
No.
So interestingly enough, he defines what it means to be Egyptian, but he doesn't think of himself as Egyptian. He thinks of himself as of a smaller place, maybe, or maybe I'm
Well,
getting it wrong.
no. I mean, you're looking at Egypt. Egypt is a very peculiar place. Um, Cairo really defines Egypt for a lot of the Egyptians. And of course, as you probably know, Cairo has 1/4 of the Egyptian population lives in Cairo. This is unusual. I mean, there are very, very few countries in the world in which 25% of the population lives in the city. The smaller countries, perhaps, I mean, Dubai and stuff like that, of course, like 100% of the population lives in the city. But look at the big countries. I mean, France comes second because about 10% of the French people live in Paris. But in Egypt is 25% of all Egyptians live in Cairo. Egypt is very much defined by
And
Cairo.
even at the time, even in Mamluk
More so,
Egypt.
more so at the time, I would say.
The last question before we wrap up is about sort of Egyptian nationalism in the 20th century, and did the sort of expression of that under Nasser and even today, as we're trying to figure out what it means to be Egyptian, did that change?
So Egypt, as I claim, and as I use this probably often quoted quotation from one of the brightest Egyptian diplomats of his own generation, Tahsin Bashir, the late Tahsin Bashir, um, to him is ascribed the sentence that Egypt is the only real nation in the region. The others are tribes with flags. This is how he defined the region. And to a large extent, he was correct. Egypt, because of its topography, is a country that has created a notion of belonging fairly early on. And we see it from the pharaonic times. I mean, imagine Egypt. You have Western desert and Eastern desert, and they're really deserts. So crossing them is not easy. And then you have the Mediterranean on top, and you have the cataracts. There are 6 cataracts that stop the navigation from Aswan down into Sudan. So they create a navigation border or boundaries between Sudan and Egypt. So being an Egyptian is actually belonging to this tiny river basin and the delta on top, because these are the only fertile lands in Egypt. And for millennia, people who lived there after the unification, which actually also shows you that it is possible to subdivide, because we know that around 3000 BC, Egypt was unified by King Mina, northern Egypt and southern Egypt. And for a very long time, the pharaohs used the 2 symbols of the north and the south. So Egypt was 2 Egypts, but then it became 1 Egypt, unified by, and I would say it very clearly, by the hydrography and the hydrology of the Nile. So being an Egyptian is very different than being Lebanese. Being Lebanese is forged, is artificial. Being Egyptian is something that the topography has actually forced upon you. But to claim that nationalism existed is perhaps a little bit of a push. It was a nationalism of the kind that I was emphasizing. It's the identification with the people.
Is when he was talking about that sense of the Sha'ab, his neighbors. Let's use the idea of like sort of neighborhood, right? So he's talking about his neck of the woods, his neighborhood, right? And he's talking about essentially his neighbors. Did he suggest any degree of xenophobia? Did he suggest any degree of, this is not a porous place? You're either from here or you're not from here. You're either Egyptian you either do things like us or you don't do things like us.
No, not at all, actually. And I have to remind you, his father was born in Baalbek and worked in Damascus. Actually, his father was born in Damascus. His grandfather was born in Baalbek. There is a reason for that. He claims that they are of Fatimid origin and that they were hiding in Baalbek after the fall of the Fatimid state, and they converted from Ismailism to Sunnism. But I mean, if we speak about origin, Maqrizi is of Syrian origin, not of Egyptian origin, according to the notion of who your father was, which is how you identified usually. But so maybe he's overcompensating in his sense of belonging to Egypt because he was not multi-generational Egyptian. But then he claims that he's Fatimid, which makes him multi-generational Egyptian, taking him back to the 10th century as an Egyptian. Um, but no, there is no xenophobia in his writing. There is actually a defense of Egypt against people who attack it who are not Egyptian. But there is no attack on other places. He has never said, for example, that Damascus sucks, or that Mecca sucks, or that I'm sitting in Mecca and I'm looking back at Cairo and missing Cairo. Quite the opposite. He enjoyed his trips, especially to Mecca. I mean, he loved being in Mecca. So no, there's no xenophobia and not even a trace of it, which is actually an interesting question. I never thought about it, that how do we, to what degree do we take his sense of belonging in the spectrum of the today's idea of sort of like an extremely tight and extremely insular sense of belonging. He did not seem to have had that. But I suspect that it would have been very difficult at the time. You might say, I'm from Cairo, but I'm from Egypt and you're not, is probably not something that you can sustain. So no xenophobia is to answer your question.
Okay. Nasser, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. I'm thrilled to have you back on the series. And as always, I'm honored that you've been such a supporter of afikra all these years.
And will remain. But thank you, Mikey, to giving me this opportunity to explain a little bit about Maqrizi for potential readers. I have to say that Al-Maqrizi exists in Arabic now as well, the book on Al-Maqrizi. And it's not exactly the same as the English book because I added a section on his religious writing and I took out the section on his Orientalist interpreters because I was actually trying to explain how he was translated to foreign languages in the English book. I don't think that the Arab readers would need to know about that. So for those who do not read English or who would like to see the Arabic book, there is a book that was published in the beginning of 2024, and it's called Taqi al-Din al-Maqrizi Wujdan al-Tarikh al-Masri. And it was published in Cairo by مركز الدراسات مركز التراث للأبحاث والدراسات. Otherwise, Maqrizi is still my companion, but I'm now moving to writing about Syria, given the fact that Syria was liberated. So my next 3 books are going to be on Syria.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Nasser. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mikey.